a quorum, I call the meeting to order and will commence in public session. Members are required to participate in the meeting remotely from within the precincts of the Leinster House complex only. Can I ask members and witnesses to please turn off their mobile phones or ensure that they are in silent mode? For members of the committee participating remotely, can you please use the raised hand icon on Microsoft Teams if you wish to contribute? Today the meeting is considering the progress of the Sustainable Development Goal targets with Coalition 2030, members of Comhdháil, hÉireann and Social Justice Ireland. The progress of the SDGs is an integral part of the committee's work and under Standing Order 100 subsection 4 it is now included in the committee's annual work programme and orders of reference. There are 5 strategic goals of the Sustainable Development Goals National Implementation Plan 2022 to 2024. The first of which is to embed the SDG framework into the work of government departments to achieve greater policy coherence for sustainable development. As the Joint Committee shadows the work of the Departments of Social Protection and Rural and Community Development in the islands, we are engaging with some interested groups to see how they feel the departments are progressing with the relevant SDG targets. Agenda 2030 acknowledges the essential role of national parliaments in ensuring accountability for effective implementation of our SDG commitments. The committee has appointed the Lasca HÉireann, Deputy Marco Cahasey, as rapporteur on this report and hopes, through his championing of the topic, that we will deliver a report that includes productive recommendations for the departments to take on board. At-risk groups who have most to gain from the Sustainable Development Goals, as identified in the January SDG National Stakeholder Forum, include children and young people, disabled people, people living with long-term health issues, older people, the travelling community, refugees, internally displaced people and migrants, people who are homeless, people with mental health issues and are affected by addiction, people living in rural Ireland, LGBTQI+ community, people who are socially, economically disadvantaged, the working poor and those below the poverty line, ethnic minorities, disconnected communities, single-parent families and carers, and victims of human trafficking. These are groups which, through both the lens of the social protection and rural community development in the islands, that this committee hopes to bring about a positive change by progressing the delivery of the Sustainable Development Goals. I'd like to welcome to the meeting today representatives from Coalition 2030, Megan Carmody, Coordinator, Coalition 2030, Johnny Sheehan, Membership and Regional Manager of the Wheel, Paul Ganell, Director of the European Anti-Poverty Network Ireland, and online my neighbour Louise Lennon, the Policy and Media Officer with our Irish Rural Link. Members of Comhdháil, hÉireann that are with us today are Aisling Moran, Development Worker, Sherkin, Long and Hare Islands, and Chair of Comhdháil, hÉireann. John Wadge, Coordinator, Bear Island Project Group, Chair of the European Small Islands Federation, and Board Member of Comhdháil, hÉireann. And of course we were in the company of both John and Aisling yesterday at a very productive meeting with Senator Paddy Burke on Clare Island and the clerk as well. Tony Rantalta, the Community Development Officer on Inishbofin and Board Member of Comhdháil, hÉireann, and Simon Murray, Board Member of Comhdháil, hÉireann. And from Social Justice Ireland, we have Suzanne Rogers, Research and Policy Analyst, and Colette Bennett, Economic and Social Analyst. You're all very welcome this morning. Before we start, I wish to explain some limitations to parliamentary privilege and the practice of the Houses as regards references you may make to other persons in your evidence. The evidence of witnesses physically present or who give evidence from within the parliamentary precincts is protected pursuant to both the Constitution and statute by absolute privilege. Witnesses are reminded of the long-standing parliamentary practice that you should not criticise or make charges against a person or entity by name or in such a way to make him, her or it identifiable, or otherwise engage in speech that might be regarded as damaging to the good name of the person or entity. Therefore, if your statements are potentially defamatory in relation to an identifiable person or entity, you are directed to discontinue your remarks. It's imperative that you comply with any such direction. Members are reminded of the long-standing parliamentary practice to the effect that they should not comment on, criticise or make charges against a person outside the House or an official either by name or such a way to make him or her identifiable. I now call on Ms Carmody to make her opening statement. Ms Carmody.
Thank you, Chair. Chairman Naughton, Deputies and Senators, Coalition 2030 is grateful for the invitation to address you today on matters relating to the Sustainable Development Goals, or SDGs. In 2015, all UN member states signed up to Agenda 2030 and committed to progressing its 17 goals, 169 targets and over 230 indicators. Agenda 2030 is aimed at ending poverty in all its forms, is grounded in the Universal Declaration on Human Rights and international human rights treaties, and emphasises the responsibilities of all states to respect, protect and promote human rights. Two underlying principles of Agenda 2030 are to leave no one behind and to reach the furthest behind first. We are halfway through the Agenda 2030 implementation period, and urgent action from all departments is required in order to achieve the SDGs. On July 19th, Ireland will present its SDG progress for peer review to the UN via the Voluntary National Review, or VNR, process. We are also, along with Qatar, co-facilitating the development of an SDG political declaration, which will be agreed this summer and unveiled at the SDG Summit in September under the auspices of the UN General Assembly. This has been described by the UN Secretary-General as the rescue plan for the SDGs, as only 12% of the targets are on track to be met globally. Ireland has made significant strides in terms of national SDG governance, in particular the 2022 policy map, which names lead departments for the achievement of specific SDG targets. However, we've identified 3 issues relevant to the departments under your purview. Firstly, the availability of appropriate data to adequately enable accountability hinders the effectiveness of the policy map. Disaggregated data is required at the indicator level in order to ascertain progress. We would encourage this committee to seek indicator data from its respective departments, as well as evidence conveying the trend in progress. Crucially, merely noting the existence of policies is not sufficient to assess progress. Secondly, the policy map is too narrow in how it ascribes responsibilities to DSP under Goal 8. DSP should have more responsibility for achieving Target 8.5, as it is responsible for the rollout of the Pathways to Work strategy, strand 4 of which is working for all, leaving no one behind. Thirdly, we have identified a serious communication error relevant to this committee which, if not addressed, risks misrepresenting our SDG progress. In Ireland's VNR, it is stated that we are achieving SDG 1, no poverty. This may be true if we use indicator 1.1.1, proportion of the population living below the international poverty line of $125. However, there's broad agreement that this measure is meaningless for people living in Ireland. Nevertheless, in our VNR summary report, the CSO conveyed our progress based on this indicator. Additionally, the 125 figure is outdated and was updated to $215 in 2022 by the World Bank. The claim that we are achieving no poverty also implies that Ireland is achieving the other SDG 1 targets, which we encourage you to investigate. Ireland is, of course, not achieving no poverty, and the furthest behind are not being reached. Overall, the percentage of people at risk of poverty increased from 11.6% in 2021 to 13.2% in 2022. 17.7% of Ireland's population is in deprivation, up from 13.8% in 2021, and the levels of people in consistent poverty are at 5.3%, up from 4%, a far way away from the government's target for consistent poverty to be 2% or less by 2025. 1 in 5 persons unable to work due to long-standing health problems are living in consistent poverty. Renters are more likely to be in poverty than owner-occupiers, and while less than 30% of our population are living in rented or rent-free accommodation, they make up over 70% of those living in consistent poverty. The at-risk of poverty rate in persons 65 and over increased from 11.9% in 2021 to 19% in 2022. Nearly 1 in 4 one-parent families are at risk of poverty, compared with 13.1% of persons in 2 adult households with 1 to 3 children. And the deprivation rate for this cohort is at almost 45%. Almost half of those who are unemployed experience deprivation, and almost 1 in 5 are in consistent poverty. Official statistics do not reflect poverty levels amongst travellers, Roma and people who are homeless. Income inadequacy is higher for people in rural areas, especially those in receipt of core social welfare payments and in low paid or minimum wage employment. Inflation is higher for lower income, older and rural households, largely because of transport and energy dependencies. And the lack of a decent public transport system in rural areas negatively affects older people and disabled people more disproportionately, who are more often reliant on a car. Rural households are more at risk of energy poverty due to limited opportunities to switch to cheaper fuels. And 42% of the rural building stock is relatively old and so is less energy efficient and has higher fuel bills than modern homes. The state depends on the C&V sector to deliver essential services and reach the furthest behind in many areas, but a lack of adequate funding creates challenges for service delivery and staff retention. And in particular, funding must be increased for supporting basic digital skills programmes, the lack of which disproportionately affects those furthest behind. In our report, we make the case that the state has so far failed to effectively embed the SDGs across government and provide the necessary political leadership for their achievement. As a result, rather than reaching the furthest behind first, instead the state has left many people behind. The state must do the following in order to address SDG governance issues and enable all departments to reach the furthest behind first. Firstly, move overall responsibility for SDG implementation to the Department of the Taoiseach. Secondly, integrate the SDGs into the budget, with every budget line linked to an SDG target, investing at least 15 million in the 2024 budget for disaggregated data collection. Third, create a national SDG policy impact measurement framework and enable the PPNs and communities to be true partners in policy design and SDG implementation. Fourth, measure what matters by resourcing the CSO to collect relevant, disaggregated and timely data which would inform policies to reach the furthest behind. And fifth, establish on a statutory footing the position of Future Generations Commissioner, whose mandate will be to ensure that no actions today undermine the sustainable future of generations to come. Given the VNR is an international peer review process, honesty is paramount. We therefore encourage this committee to scrutinise claims relating to its department's progress and how efforts to date are communicated to the Irish public and internationally. We suggest that your departments ensure that nationally relevant data is employed in our national SDG assessments. There now exists an opportunity for this, as the CSO are working with DEC to look at targets in an Irish context. And so we encourage you to ensure your departments actively engage with this process. We must measure what matters and employ more useful data in order to reach the furthest behind first. Without shifts in our approach to measurement, as well as other elements of governance, the state will continue to struggle to reach the furthest behind first, rendering delivery on the SDGs categorically unachievable. We are living through the last best chance to achieve the SDGs, and your committee has a crucial role to play. I'll now hand back to you, Chair, and my colleagues and I welcome questions and comments.
Thanks very much, Ms Carmody, for your opening comments. We now have Ms Rantala from Comhdháil and hÉireann.
The Board of Comhdháil Dáil and hÉireann expresses thanks to the Chair, Deputies, Senators and officials of the Joint Committee for the opportunity to discuss how the Sustainable Development Goals are being and can be achieved on the offshore islands. For the purposes of providing an overview of the key issues that can be emphasised concerning the SDG goals, we have categorised them in 4 different areas. You may see this in the document that has been sent to you beforehand. Some goals highlight the gaps and challenges that affect our daily lives on the islands. Other goals relate to barriers faced in sustaining island communities, such as availability of affordable housing. Also, goals are highlighted that demonstrate how islands and islanders can actively contribute to addressing environmental issues. Certain goals showcase the valuable role that islands play as part of a positive change. Among the factors that impact our daily lives, such as lack of childcare, elder care, or access to clean water, we would like to draw your attention to the issue of higher living costs. Poverty, as well as social inequity and lack of inclusivity, can often be hidden in rural areas and communities like the islands. Bringing the cost of and access to basic commodities such as food, energy, housing, education and healthcare to the national level would stimulate the island economies, improve livelihoods and enhance the overall well-being and stability of island communities. Examples of practical measures should include ferry and freight subsidy system that keeps the cost as low as possible to reduce added financial expense on islanders. Under the current system, cost to islanders for freight can be over 250% higher than on the mainland. Several SDGs relate to the barriers to the sustainability and growth of island communities, such as inadequate infrastructure and facilities, limited access to basic services, and uncertainties related to education. In the current housing crisis, islands are not an exception. To highlight just one barrier to growth, we urgently need more affordable and suitable housing options. Updated laws on planning policy limit islanders from building on their own islands. The demand for second home ownership has driven the price of island housing beyond the reach of islanders. We currently have island residents unable to find suitable housing, young people unable to establish their own households, and we have island descendants who are not able to return to their home island. It is not a lack of islanders, but rather a lack of affordable, suitable housing that poses a challenge. The outcomes of the Offshore Islands Housing Study, carried out by and currently being analysed by University College Cork, will provide recommendations for the offshore islands. The vacant property refurbishment grant and the top-up for the islands is welcomed, especially as turning an old stone cottage into a modern, energy-efficient home is not without substantial cost and challenges. The SDGs can show where the challenges are, but in the case of the islands, they also show where there is great potential. For instance, sustainable fishing practices and food production on islands showcase best practices for coexistence between people and their surroundings, both on land and in the surrounding waters. Islands have both the potential and will to act as forerunners in climate action. On an offshore island, you experience nature firsthand through the storms and rough seas, which can disrupt all plans for travel, and this is what truly separates us from our mainland counterparts. We will also experience the impacts of climate change through droughts and rising sea levels. The CAI home retrofit scheme is welcomed, but unfortunately will not translate due to higher construction cost and set requirements for contractors. With your support, we want to take on these challenges, and islands are ideal test beds for climate action and showcasing sustainable solutions. We hope you recognize that offshore islands as part of the solutions and positive change. There are great possibilities for sustainable growth on the islands. We welcome the instruments enabling the creation of remote working facilities, and the provision of the vital fibre optic cable connections will attract both emigrant islanders and new residents to the islands. Blue economy is at the heart of the European Green Deal and the Recovery Plan for Europe. The offshore islands are already working with and welcome the planning support through, for example, the Clean Energy for EU Islands Secretariat and the support for energy master plans through SCAI. Besides renewable energy, this sector means contributing through sustainable food production and tourism, as well as emerging fields such as seaweed farming and marine biotech. We aim for best practice examples of supporting the circular economy through modern waste recycling facilities on the offshore islands. These initiatives are not only seen by the islanders, but by the tens of thousands of visitors who get to experience them on the offshore islands. However, in order for the offshore islands to persevere, live, and thrive, we want to highlight that real financial support for infrastructure projects, lifeline services, and capital works is needed. A consistent and properly funded island capital budget program and ring-fenced funding for island projects are critical to the long-term sustainability of the offshore islands. An overview of the SDG goals in the context of the offshore islands showcases how the SDG goals are interconnected and mutually reinforcing. It shows how positive progress on one goal will have ripple effects. On the other hand, failing to address some could prevent any progress on others. The aim is to ensure that sustainable, vibrant communities can continue to live and thrive on the offshore islands for many years to come. This is a quote from Our Living Islands, the new National Islands policy, which was just launched 2 weeks ago. We hope that the new islands policy will translate into real current support and funding for the offshore islands and into success stories on how the SDG goals can be achieved through cross-sectoral collaboration and interdepartmental efforts. We thank the committee for your time and are happy to answer any questions you might have. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Ms. Rantala. Now, the final opening statement is coming from Ms. Bennett on behalf of Social Justice Ireland.
Thank you, Chair. We wish to thank the committee for the opportunity to speak with you today on the subject of the Sustainable Development Goals and the progress of individual departments. It's obviously a very timely meeting in light of the Voluntary National Review and preparations for Budget 24. As the committee is no doubt aware, Social Justice Ireland publish a Sustainable Progress Index every year, ranking Ireland's progress towards the SDGs against our now EU 14 peers. In this year's edition, Ireland's overall ranking was 9th out of 14, but we also have sub-indices on Ireland's performance on the economy, society and the environment, where we rank 9th, 6th and 9th respectively. Our index concludes with a series of policy recommendations at local and national level to help improve Ireland's rankings. And while we're aware of the remit of this committee and the relevant department, as the Chair and the committee are no doubt aware, the SDGs are a policy framework for all government departments and all policy, and all departments have a role to play in achieving them. On SDG 1, no poverty, we know that poverty is increasing in Ireland. There are 671,000 people in poverty. More than 188,600 of those are children. And that will make achieving the 2030 target very challenging. All our recommendations in this context aim to enhance the standard of living of people who are most marginalised. We would also urge the Department to fund research on the impact of the recent cost of living increases on low-income households. This could begin with MABS clients who fall under the Department of Social Protection and who are funded by the Department. They have a wealth of information in relation to household budgets over time and would really be a really good place to start. On SDG 2, Zero Hunger, we use indicators that are more relevant to poor nutrition and food security. And policies in this area include expanding the Hot School Meals programme, particularly for schools and preschools in disadvantaged areas and those with a high concentration of homeless children and children living in direct provision or who do not have their own cooking facilities. On SDG 3, Good Health, policies in this area include ensuring that announced budgetary allocations are valid, realistic and transparent, and that they take existing commitments into account. We know, for example, that IFAC published in 2019 the figure of 900 million just to stand still for existing levels of service, taking into account demographic change. So any increase in the health budget has to include that amount. We also must improve the process of planning and investment so that the healthcare system can cope with the increase and diversity in population and the ageing of the population projected for the next few decades. On SDG 4, in good education, we score very highly in this goal overall, but it remains important to address educational disadvantage. We must work to improve educational outcomes for pupils from disadvantaged backgrounds and disadvantaged communities, alongside the development of an integrated skills strategy with a focus on lifelong learning. On SDG 5, gender equality, we need to introduce a universal state social welfare pension, which is something we've been calling for quite some time. We must meet our Istanbul Convention obligations and provide sufficient resources to combat what was called in the programme for government the epidemic of domestic abuse. Essentially, we must support high-quality community childcare, particularly in areas of socio-economic disadvantage. On SDG 6, clean water and sanitation, our policy recommendations include continuing to provide support and advice to farmers to improve water quality under the Agricultural Sustainability Support and Advice Programme, and the development of a drinking water safety plan following EPA guidelines for each public water supply. On SDG 7, renewable energy, we need to upgrade the national grid and invest in the infrastructure necessary to support the transition to renewable energy. And in fact, one of our asks in Budget 2024 is the investment of $1 billion of the surplus in infrastructure for wind energy. We need to invest in research and development for the use of renewable energy in our public transport systems, and as part of our Budget 24 recommendations, on SDG 8, good jobs and economic growth, our policy proposals here include launching a major investment programme focused on prioritising initiatives that strengthen social infrastructure, including a comprehensive school building programme and much larger social housing programme, and supporting the adoption of a real living wage at $13.85 per hour. On SDG 9, industry, innovation and infrastructure, policy recommendations centre on the need for greater investment in social infrastructure and readiness for digitalisation. SDG 10, reduced inequalities. We've seen, as Megan has also said, the increase in inequality and the increase in poverty between 21 and 22. The latest Oxfam report also talked about the growing number of millionaires and billionaires, while we have those 671,000 people who are living below the poverty line. So some policy recommendations here include the elimination of barriers faced by people with disabilities in accessing basic services such as housing, healthcare and education, fully implementing the recommendations of the Commission for the Elimination of Racial Discrimination and the 2019 Trafficking in Persons report. On SDG 11, Sustainable Cities and Communities, we propose setting a target of 20% of all housing stock to be social housing by 2030, resourcing the enforcement of legislation targeting short-term lettings, and the beginning of the process of reducing the reliance on the rental sector and housing subsidies. On SDG 12, Responsible Consumption, our policy proposals include introducing a circular economy package for Ireland across all areas of economic activity, a levy on single-use plastics, taxing air travel, reintroducing the windfall gains tax at 80%, and exploring new initiatives to promote behavioural change through the tax system. On SDG 13, climate action, we recommend establishing a just transition and adaptation dialogue to ensure rural areas are not disproportionately impacted by low carbon policies and are supported to meet the challenges posed by the future of work. On SDG 14, Life Below Water, our policies include fully implementing the National Integrated Maritime Plan, regulating harvesting and ending overfishing, and implementing policies to restore fishing stocks to sustainable levels. On SDG 15, Life on Land, our policy proposals include increasing afforestation of native trees, ensuring that sustainable agriculture policy and sustainable land management form the basis of future agricultural policy, investing in programmes to re-wet the boglands, and implementing the nature programme set out in the Climate Action Plan. On SDG 16, Peace and Justice, our proposals include ensuring the national economic and social dialogue or partnership include all 5 pillars, restoring funding to the community and voluntary pillar, ensuring adequate funding for civil legal aid and greater transparency of lobbying activities, and establishing a dialogue forum in every local authority involving local authorities and public participation networks. And on SDG 17, Partnerships for the Goals, our policy proposals include increasing ODA to move towards the UN target of 0.75% of national, 0.7% of national income, adopting targets and reporting system for the Sustainable Development Goals, tagging all government policies and policy proposals with the relevant goals, adopting targets and a reporting system for each of the SDGs, developing a new national index of progress, ensuring social and environmental issues are incorporated into our national accounts, including in the Commission for Regulation Lobbying's annual reports, policy areas with the greatest lobbying activity, the lobbying organisations and the designated public officials engaged to highlight to the general public those influencing the political decision-making process. In conclusion, it is important to note that the SDGs provide a policy framework for governments to progress towards a more sustainable society and economy overall. Our index also proposes that the SDGs be used to underpin a new social contract to ensure the well-being of all in Ireland, and to promote both local and national social dialogue to ensure that all people have a say in the decisions being made that affect their everyday lives. We welcome questions. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Ms Bennett. And the first questioner that is indicated is the Lasca Hírleach, Deputy O'Cahcy.
Thank you very much, Chairperson, and thanks to everybody who presented today. It's very helpful. It's the, as the Chair alluded to, it's been provided now for standing orders of the committee, and I think it's the first time that we've had a good run at it as a committee to really nail down those areas that we are responsible for, or that the departments that we're shadowing are responsible for. And it's an interesting case study in that obviously social protection is the headline thing, and probably the point at which most of the SDGs that the department is asked to track come into play. But we also have that rural and community development piece, and then crucially we have the islands piece as well. And just I did have a quick look. I think actually the islands, if I can start there, is a very interesting case study of that kind of central notion that you should try to reach the furthest behind first. And clearly the islands are geographically more distant from the rest of us than a lot of places. So even when I was looking through the SDGs that I thought might be relevant, I mean, education obviously comes across again and again. The childcare issue, I know from visiting John and people out in Beara that childcare issue is a real problem. And then one that jumped out on me was just about equality, about excuse me here, the use of enabling technology, particularly information and communications technology, to promote the empowerment of women. And a lot of the stories we heard about one person in the couple having to take a step back from work because there's not adequate childcare facilities on the island, so you take a step back when your children are young. And then even if you're looking to do the remote and blended work, well, very often there's one broadband connection point on the island that's going to provide you with the connectivity for that. So it's a very interesting case study in how the SDGs don't apply in a universal or in a homogenous way across the society. So people on the islands, people of minority communities, the travelling people, for example, travellers, I think there's a specific role for applying the SDGs there and making sure that we're doing that central piece of reaching the first or the furthest behind first. I think both Social Justice Ireland and Coalition 2030 do very, very valuable work in this space. I think the Social Justice Ireland year-on-year report is really, really important to keep the awareness of the SDGs kind of front and centre in people's mind. So I hope you don't mind if some of my questions are going to be slightly challenging on it, because I do want to dig down into the specifics. So Megan, I just want to, for you first, for Coalition 2030, I want to have a look at this idea of the availability of disaggregated data, because of course it is pivotal if you're trying to make decisions. And I've been looking through what I think is, like, from my point of view, is a fairly comprehensive website, which is the CSO website on the Sustainable Development Goals. And of course, a lot of that CSO data is front and centre in the VNR report. It's kind of the linchpin that we're hanging the VNR report on it. And I know Coalition 2030 have a submission in there, as do the All-Party Oireachtas group. It's quite detailed when I dig into it. Even I just had a look at, I've clicked through into the Goal 1 data, and we do have each of the sub-goals and sub-targets provided for, across regional, across the year. I'm just wondering when you say disaggregated data and looking at the amount of data that's available on that CSO website, what it is exactly that you're talking about that you would like to see more of? Is it around breakdown by gender, for example, or where is it that you see the deficiencies in that?
So where we see the deficiencies in it is twofold. Firstly, they do have a lot of data already, as you pointed out. Largely, it's based on the usual age, geographic location, but we need to be looking at the disaggregated data based on international dimensions of discrimination. So, for example, gender, as you pointed out, children, refugees, migrants, basically all of the categories that Chair Naughton pointed out earlier on. We understand that this is a tall ask, but we know from our engagement with the CSO that the CSO is under-resourced at the moment to do that level of disaggregated data collection. So without that baseline measurement of where we are and who we are reaching, it's very difficult to ascertain targets and to show progress and to show that trend. So that's what disability would be another one. Various of the categories that we point out in our report. That's what we need to do, and we know that it's challenging, but the Irish Human Rights and Equality Commission can also help with this. So we do think that they also need significant resourcing to be able to align their human rights data collection with the SDGs, so that we're not reinventing the wheel. You know, there are two very strong institutions that we have at our disposal, apologies, and they're not aligned at the moment for collection of SDG relevant disaggregated data. So that'd be the first thing. And the second is the communication of this data. So you alluded to it, that it's quite a complex website. So if you go on the SDG CSO website, it's very layered. You really need to do a lot of digging to get basic answers of how are we doing on specific SDG targets. It's not clear, it's not all in one place. Infographics are developed every few years, but some of the data is very old. There's a figure in there from 2012 in one of the infographics. We have a question around where this is being publicised to the public. How is it getting out there to people? How do people know how we're doing on these SDG targets, and importantly, what the progress is in terms of the trend? And there's a second website which is often cited by the CSO, the GeoHive. Now, this is often cited to us as a very useful SDG resource, but it has also been called for high-level people, for people who are statisticians, essentially. It's very difficult to navigate, and you can't find those answers to simple questions like how are we doing on each SDG target. So they would be our two main issues with the CSO at the moment.
Okay. Colette, if I can turn to you, and as I say, I do think that that report that you do each year is a really important and really powerful waymarker in terms of just making sure that there is attention drawn to our progress and sustainable development goals. And I suppose there's a few ways of looking at it. I note that you respect us, that we place 9th overall, is that right? 9th out of 14. But I suppose on the positive side, just looking at Ireland's current SDG dashboard within your report, at least the arrows in all of that, there's too much red on that dashboard in terms of us being, places where we have major challenge, and obviously places like climate action would stand out for me. But at least the arrows are pointing in the right direction. I just want to ask a question about whether we're comparing like with like in terms of your assessment. So when I look at the assessment from the CSO that's in the VNR report, for example, on Goal 1, which is ending poverty in all of its forms, according to the CSO, we have data sourced for all of those targets within that goal, and then all targets are being achieved. So it's a clean slate as far as the CSO is concerned, whereas your assessment is quite different. But I just want to make sure that we're comparing like with like. So I know that you referenced that target 1.1, which is, what is it, $1.25 a day or something, which of course isn't, you couldn't apply that to in a meaningful way to the developed economy. Or you can, and you can say, yeah, we got there, $1.25, we managed to clear that bar. But there are other sub-targets within that goal, which I could run through if I had another screen, but I think I'm kind of maxed out in numbers of screens I have in front of me currently. So could you explain to me how, I suppose, your assessment, and let's take that one of zero poverty, because it does bear on the work of this committee, how your assessment is at such variance to the assessment of the CSO that we see in the VNR report?
Thank you very much. Thank you for the question. Yes, I suppose our assessment, because it's a comparative report, so it's comparing Ireland with our EU 14 peers, we needed to gather data that is comparable across the EU 14. So if you go to our report on page 79, it's the appendix, and it goes through each of the indicators that are used and the source of those indicators. Because as you say, some of the indicators that might come under zero poverty, for example, just doesn't apply to a developed economy like ours. Similar, our indicators around world hunger aren't about, undernutrition and starvation. It's more about obesity indicators and food quality. So in terms of SDG 1, we have poverty rate after taxes and transfers with a poverty line of 50%, and that's sourced from the OECD because we can compare that across the EU 14. People living in households with low work intensity and the share of severely deprived people. So they're the indicators that we use to measure the progress in comparison to our European peers.
Okay. It does make it a little bit difficult because I think it's a very valuable analysis, but the goalposts have moved a little bit in terms of, and I think we need to be fully clear when we're looking at your report, which, as I said, is a really useful report, but we're not necessarily looking at the actual sub-targets that were in the SDGs. We're looking at a set of targets that we have kind of, I suppose, modified to take account of the fact we're a developed economy.
And if I may, there's a reason for that also. First of all, because it's a comparative report, we need to be able to use the same data as the other 14 countries. But second to that, and very similar to Megan's point, a lot of the data just isn't available or isn't available up to date. And back in 2018, we did write to the then Minister in relation to data gaps, looking for additional resources to be provided to the CSO to actually bridge those gaps and make sure that we had more robust data that we could base our index on.
Yeah, and I actually think the CSO has done a fantastic job of filling in a lot of gaps, and I hope that, now that they have that initial framework in place, that they'll be able to look at that disaggregated data piece and help people drill down a little more. Would I have time for one more?
Yep.
Megan, to come back to you, and this is another hobby horse of mine, but I see that you've included here in your opening statement the idea of a Future Generations Commissioner. And I know the Welsh are probably leading out on this, but if you could just talk to us a little about how you see the potential of that role within an Irish context, and particularly within the frame of the Sustainable Development Goals.
Yeah, absolutely. So it goes back to the original definition of sustainable development, which was defined in the Brundtland Commission's report in 1987. Development that meets the needs of the present without compromising the ability of future generations to meet their own needs. So this role of a Future Generations Commissioner, which we emphasise really would need to be on statutory footing and last between governments and not be solely a role that only exists for one particular government. It needs to be a very long-lasting role. This person would not necessarily have the teeth to create policy, but they would have the teeth to generate an opinion and have a space to share how certain policies do or do not align with this definition of sustainable development. You cited Wales, so the then Future Generations Commissioner, Sophie Howe, was able to input on a plan for developing more road infrastructure for the Welsh Government. And because that specific plan didn't align with their Wellbeing of Future Generations Act, the project was scrapped. So it really is one person who's challenged with identifying issues to do with policy coherence, both today and into the future. There are many really positive examples around the world in addition to the Future Generations Commissioner. Ministries of the future, committees for the future, ombudsman for the future. There are many different things that we could do. We really do think that Ireland is in a very positive space to be able to do that. We have led on a lot of very innovative policies in the past number of years, and very few countries do have a Future Generations Commissioner, and we could be part of that vanguard. So I'm happy to send some follow-up information as well, more specific details about that roads project and the role of this Commissioner afterwards, if you'd like.
Thank you, appreciate that. Deputy Donnelly, just before I get Deputy Donnelly in, there's some devices that are not on silent, so could people just put them on silent, please? Deputy Donnelly.
Thanks very much, Carlock. Thanks very much for the presentations. I recognise some of the faces from the islands as well. We were there last year. Just in relation to the islands piece, I suppose the one that struck me, obviously Joy Care was a big one, but the housing piece was something that struck me as a particularly difficult one, and trying to look at the tourism piece and to ensure that obviously that the lifeblood in the summer of money coming in and having capacity to get people in, but then how does that affect people living on the islands? Because again, what really struck me is I saw a lot of properties there that had been sold that people were saying were pretty much empty once the summer season is gone. These were built by people on the islands who then sold them off to people from outside the islands who used them as an income, as a second income. And how do we, so it'd be interesting in your ideas about how are you going to ensure that if there is affordable housing being built on the islands, how does it not fall into the hands of people who from outside who are just going to use it as maybe a summer property and then leave it empty for the winter? And then how does that help with sustainable growth? I think it's something that really struck me, that there's a big issue with that. In terms of the sustainable goals, there's a few things that really struck me. In COVID, we really noticed the digital poverty and the digital disadvantage. That we were getting reports of young people in particular in schools, when all the schools closed, that they were doing the homework on mobile phones if they had access to a mobile phone or access to the internet, which was a big problem. And I know some of the partnership, I know our partnership in Empower in Dublin 15 set up a project and got funding from the department to try and bridge that gap. But it is definitely it's a significant one, that there are people in our communities who do not have the access to the laptop, or if there's 3 children, there are certainly not 3 laptops. And then I suppose all of the issues in relation to that, and I suppose just a question around that. The other thing that struck me as well is we got a presentation yesterday from the Irish Heart Foundation, and one of the issues around medical cards and access to medical cards. And access and the cost of medication for people who previously would have been in fairly well-paid jobs, doing quite good, and then all of a sudden they've got this condition and now they cannot work, and then their income just falls through the floor at the same time that medication, but their income be just slightly a bit above. Maybe a partner is working, so they're not entitled to a medical card. I think that's a really significant one, and also identifies the issue of health, which also fits into the other strategic goal around. I was very interested in listening to the highly processed foods and looking at putting warnings on highly processed foods and the complexity of that, because there are some highly processed foods that are actually quite good for you. And I think there's a real challenge about poverty, about access to healthy foods, because again, most of the healthy foods that we're talking about are more expensive than the highly processed foods like burgers and things like that, and sausages. So again, I think it's another huge challenge, and it goes back to this. I think the first goal, which is how do we create an income level playing field, so that people can access those. The other thing which is interesting is around quality education, and it's something that's been raised certainly in my area around the DESH Plus, and I'd be interested your thoughts around that. That we obviously have DESH, but there are a lot of schools, a number of schools in areas. I'm not going to name them, but they would be, huge difficulties, huge disadvantage, huge poverty, huge problems around access to mental health services, to SNAs, to additional needs services. So all of those things that create huge problems and difficulties for schools in trying to ensure that every child in that school has a level playing field, that they can attain the best level of education that they possibly can. And then the last piece was just around waste management. And there's now a growing move around I'm going to say this word, it's very difficult to say, remunicipalisation, of waste management. Because we all know dumping, particularly in Dublin and sort of the cities, is a huge problem. Absolutely huge problem affecting our communities. And even if you drive through the city, like there's 3 or 4 different waste management companies in the city. And I was actually going through the city last night, and it just seems to be everywhere. And even when the businesses are putting their rubbish out on the streets, it's in plastic bags and it's getting ripped apart by seagulls and by birds and stuff like that. The place just looks really bad. And I think that's because there's no coherent strategy around waste management, because it's been privatised and because there are 3 or 4 different companies. And the other thing around privatisation, which is becoming apparent, is that there really isn't competition. This thing that we were told there was competition in the market that would reduce prices and, you know, we'd have a wonderful system. It's not happening, because there are many parts of Dublin, and certainly in my constituency, where only one company goes in and picks up the rubbish. And there's somewhere you'll have 3 or 4 different companies, or 2 different companies at least. But in some, I don't know whether I'm not going to say it's a cartel or whether it's going to be an agreement between others, but there is only one company going in, and the other company will not do business in that particular estate. And we know now that the prices for waste collection are going absolutely off the scales. And the one that really bugs me is that we were told this lie of you only pay for what you throw away. And that's not the truth. We're paying for everything now. So your green, your brown and your black bin, and everyone is paying an ever-increasing price. That's fine if you're in a good job and you can pay, but for a lot of people, that's a real struggle now. And people now are refusing to use the brown bin, and they're finding other inventive ways of getting rid of their recycling. And that's putting pressure on the recycling centres, which some are free, and the council are now looking to charge for those recycling centres. So just in around, I suppose, that issue around waste management, I appreciate it. Just again, thank Mark for some of the questions that he's already asked.
Thanks very much, Deputy Donnelly. I think that there's a broad-ranging set of questions there, so we might start in the peripheral and work up to the witnesses here. So we might start with Aisling and Comhdháil and the hÉireann team there in terms of who wants to come in. There were some specific questions there. There were more broader questions that impact on island communities. Might get Louise to come in then from a rural perspective in relation to those, and we come to the witnesses here in the committee room then. So over to you, Aisling, first of all.
Yeah, perfect. I'm just wondering, does Tully or Simon want to come in on the first bit of it around education? Yeah.
Tully, do you want to come in there?
And the access to education, that might be for you guys.
Yeah, sure. So this is actually, especially for some islands, a big challenge, the lack of second-level education on the islands. So currently, the situation for our children of the age of 12 onwards is that they can't live on their home island. They need to move to the mainland to get access to second-level education. And obviously, this creates a lot of effects on the families who need to maintain 2 households. The support grant for that's available at the moment, I think it's around 4,000 euro a year, is only available for households where the parents don't live with the children on the mainland. So I think it's 5 out of 10 of the islands who have second-level education at the moment. And this is really an issue that could be easily solved through having satellite education through the digital technology that's available at the moment and collaboration between the schools. Simon, do you want to comment on that?
Tully, if you could answer one question for me there. You specifically referenced satellite education. And as you know, we have 5 of the islands that have second-level schools, every one of which have high-speed broadband. In fairness, Minister Pat Rabbitt at the time delivered that and started with the islands first. How has the use of broadband developed the range of subjects in those 5 schools? Now, you may not be able to answer that to now, and I'm not putting you under the pin of your collar today, But it would be interesting if Comhdháil could come back to us and see how has broadband changed the delivery of the subject range for students on those 5 islands, so that we could then look at replicating that. Because I think that's a significant element, and I know that, and correct me if I'm wrong, I think quite a number of the island schools come under the education and training boards, which would mean that there's a responsibility on the ETBs to provide that broad range, not just for islands. I represent a part of the country in East Galway where we have a lot of small second-level schools with limited subject range, and we're not using the broadband capacity that's there. Some of the ETBs that are covering a number of island communities as well as my part of East Galway. But if you could maybe come back to the committee on that specific issue, not necessarily today, but at a later date. Thanks. Sorry for cutting across you.
No problem. Yeah, absolutely. And I think there are a lot of potential with shared resources and the broadband connectivity, especially when we have fibre cable on the islands. And there are a lot of good examples on this all around the world already. There are schools currently operating entirely online, but a combination of local resources and shared resources, perhaps even across different rural communities, the islands, but why not also other rural communities for the special subjects, is definitely the way ahead.
Thanks. Can I come in there? So thanks, Dáil.
Sorry, Aisling, just anyone that's coming in remotely, if you could just introduce yourselves, because it just makes it easier for transcribing here, just to give your name, because it mightn't just be clear to us here who's actually speaking.
Yeah, perfect. No hassle. It's Aisling Moore, Chair of Comhdháil and hÉireann. So thank you very much for having us here today and for reviewing the Sustainable Development Goals. I think it's really important for all of us. On housing, which is one of the biggest issues, and thanks for raising it. I think the first thing to address with housing is we have a housing issue. So, and we have a housing issue for islanders, as Tully said. And I appreciate that the question that Mark O'Casig asked is, if you have affordable housing, how do you stop it from going into holiday homes? How do you stop that all over the country? Like, we've looked at this, time and time again. It's a difficult one. We can't be the judges or the people to come down and say, well, you can't sell your house to somebody, or if it does, it has to be at a national level or a national policy. We need to solve the problem of housing first. That would be my answer, and it has to be addressed on all different levels, with social housing, affordable housing, planning, gateway housing, which is a new way. So we talk about affordable housing, and that's just a system we know about, but we don't talk about gateway housing, which might be housing within a community that is supported to let people live within a community for a couple of years, and then if the planning laws were there, that they could build on their own. So I think we have a long way to come with the Sustainable Development Goals around housing. I think we can look at all of those aspects around housing with the Sustainable Development Goals, and we've got another report, a national housing report coming out that's done by UCC. We've also got the National Islands Policy, and I would hope that over the next couple of years that much more of the Sustainable Development Goals would be hit by implementation of some of the recommendations out of those both those reports. But we'd appreciate, as we say, it all needs financial support as well within that, and constant reviewing. So I just want to know, do any of my other colleagues want to comment on or answer any of the questions that were posed by Deputy O'Casig there?
John or Simon, do you want to come in on either of those?
John Walsh from Bear Island. I'd have to agree with Aisling as well. It is very difficult to control the selling of houses. I think there's a multi-action needed to solve the housing crisis in the islands, and I think the island policy will help in doing it. But to actually say to someone you can't sell your house to a certain person, I think that has huge implications to the island communities. But when I looked at the Sustainable Development Goals, when we were developing our own strategic plan for Bear Island, Whiddy Island and Dursey Island, just say two main things that came into view for us, and when we're talking about different sustainable development goals, say Sustainable Development Goal 6, clean water and sanitation. In the last month, I've been on 3 islands: Whiddy Island, Inisheer, and Clare Island yesterday, and the 3 islands don't have drinkable water, which in this day and age is shocking to say. Also under infrastructure, again, like Clare Island yesterday, Runa Pier, shocking, coming out of Clare Island into Runa Pier from either Inishturk or Clare Island, that there isn't in this day and age a proper facility for them to land on. It just, again, it goes to show that since 2015, the goals don't take into account islands. And again, Inisheer Pier, on it a few weeks ago, probably the busiest pier in Ireland, I would say. I know my colleague Paddy Crowe, for many years, he was trying to get the pier done there. Chloe O'Malley's working on it at the moment, and hopefully there'll be news soon. And again, looking at Sustainable Development Goal 5, gender equality on the islands, again, we do not have access to services like family resource centres. I think Bear Island, where I live myself, is the only island that we actually do work with, Bear West Family Resource Centre, but I don't think any other island gets services of a family support worker. And again, the SICAP programme, which is supposed to be for every resident of the state, again, the West Cork Islands get it because Cork County Council actually made a lot of the islands, so when they were tendering it out, Cornellan was able to apply for it. The other islands don't have that service, which is again, the state is kind of lacking in service to the island under social inclusion. So just on them points there, just to raise that, I think it's important to say it.
Thank you. Simon, did you have anything that you wanted to add?
Yeah, I suppose just a couple of things that are, I suppose, underneath the surface of all conversations in relation to islands, and that's cost, the cost of living on an island. And we operate a subsidised system in this country, rightly so, in order to try and keep the islands alive and our communities alive, because of the benefits they give back through tourism and many other avenues. But I suppose our subsidised system for freight, if you're not familiar with it, puts the cost of living up on the islands, which is a bizarre statement, but that's the truth. So if you have a subsidised system, it should not be increasing the cost of living on the island. And we're talking about housing there, which you've all touched on. So through a subsidised system, in order to build a house here, or renovation or whatever it may be, any works to a house, you're looking at, because of the system that's in place, you're looking at a 30% increase on the cost of building. And that's just not good enough. So if we are being serious about islands, and we've had our policy document launched there a couple of weeks ago, but if we're being serious about the continuation of life on our islands, and we have lost many islands over the years, and we're now left with a very small number. So we don't have the population to make an argument. I mean, that's the key principle of rural living, full stop. So if it's going to be all based on population, well, then that's not going to work for us. So the nuances have to be to look at islands in the context of we want islands to survive off our coast. Being an island nation, you think that would be an obvious thing. But that has to be met with, in every department, county council and structures, basically, of the government system in this country. And if we have to be still arguing at this stage in 2023, I'm not sure how much forward we've gone, you know. So if you're talking about housing and health and everything else, if you have a system that's in place, that's run by the state, that's putting up the costs of living on an island, then that has to be addressed. And I would ask the committee, if it's within your remit, that someone needs to do root and branch review of the subsidised system for the islands, because it's just, you know, it's a little bit out of control, and it's killing productivity on the islands. So if we're hoping to house people and we're hoping for a future for the islands, then we need to address the costs that we can address immediately, and this is one that could be done immediately. This is a review that could be carried out, the tendering process could be changed, new tender document in place, bang, that's it. Cost of living comes down on the island. Simple thing like that, make a huge difference.
Thanks very much. Louise Lennon from Irish Rural Link.
Thanks, Chair, and thank you for inviting us today. And as the Chair said, Louise Lennon from Irish Rural Link, and I'm attending today with the Coalition 2030. I suppose just in general with the SDGs, and I suppose the Department of Rural and Community Development would be, I suppose, our main department we'd deal with, just around, their progress on the SDGs, and I suppose just looking back on their overall policy and strategy of our rural future. A lot of the actions are around sustainable communities and decent work, but it seems to lack that whole poverty piece and equality. And I think, for the next policy, they're starting to think about the next 5-year strategy as well. That needs to be included. You heard from my colleagues that rural areas are very, they have higher income inadequacies. The homes are harder to heat, and I think that needs to be addressed across government. Just picking up on some of the questions Deputy Donnelly had asked or referred to, just around the whole education piece, and I suppose digital and the broadband and the difficulties during COVID. And we've called for a long time for high-speed broadband, and welcome that it is being rolled out. But there's still parts that and still homes that are still without broadband, and the difficulty that caused and is still causing for homes or people trying to work from home. But it's more about, I suppose, having that equipment for lower income households and poorer households, that having the laptop or the computer, or having to share one piece of equipment between maybe 3 or 4 children in a family can cause difficulties. And also for older people, having the digital skills, and as I suppose we move to e-tech and e-health, I suppose we have an ageing population. Access to GPs has become more difficult for older people in rural areas. I suppose GPs are beginning to retire when they retire, and it's getting difficult to replace them in rural areas. And then having to travel, then if they don't have access to a car, it can become more difficult. So I think the need for those enhancing the lifelong skills for people, and it has to go across the whole life cycle, so that they have the skills and are equipped to use technology and use, I suppose, technologies that can help them remain in their homes as they get older. I just also want to pick up, as Deputy Donnelly had mentioned, around waste management. And I suppose in rural areas it is more difficult as well for people, for not only the cost, but to manage their waste as well. Again, it is all private companies that are delivering the waste management services, recycling, but a lot of rural areas don't have those facilities even to them, and a lot don't have the brown bin isn't an option. And a lot of the argument is that, if you contact your waste management service, you're told there's not enough people in the area using the service. So there could be 3 or 4 bin lorries out a week, but they're all from different companies. So not having that service available to people is increasing the cost. Then the food goes into the black bin, we'll say, or the general waste bin. and it is pushing up the cost for people. Just as well on some of a few other things, just around the whole, again, the transport still remains a major issue for people in rural areas. Access to public transport, you know, it's, if we're serious about achieving the SDGs, you know, the climate targets, you know, reducing poverty, you know, because transport for people in rural areas is a major cost. So there needs to be proper investment in rural transport, and I suppose in ensuring that it is I suppose adaptable to the community needs and the local needs of that area. Just I suppose the SDGs as well, bringing them in, you know, how can communicating them out more to people in rural areas as well, like the PPNs are there, you know, so ensuring that, you know, that it's brought in with the PPNs, and it can, you know, that they're aware of them as well, and their knowledge is up to date on it. And there's also now town teams being developed. So ensuring that they have access to the information, and that it's easily accessible, and I suppose in plain language as well. Like a lot of people on PPNs, a lot of people on these town teams are volunteers. They're from the local community. So making sure, you know, the language used is accessible to everyone will be important. Thank you.
Thank you. Mr. Paul Cannell, you want to answer some of those questions?
Thank you. Thank you, Chair, and thank you to Deputy Donnelly as well for his points he raised. I just wanted to come back to one of the key issues which links to the issue about affording quality food, healthy food, but it also links to affordability in terms of education, other services and other areas that people need access to in their lives. Just a key point for us would be in relation to income adequacy being at the basis of a lot of the unaffordability of healthy food, of access to education and so on, that impacts on a lot of, on transport, other areas it impacts on a lot of families across the country. I don't know if you're aware of the minimum essential standard of living researchers carried out previously with the Ascension Partner for Social Justice, and now is in the Vincent de Paul. And they have published recently their updated data for 2022, which shows that in terms of the 214 household types that are depending on social welfare that they researched in 2022, 127 of those will experience deep income inadequacy in terms of affording a minimum essential standard of living. 60 will have an inadequate income, and 27 just will be able to afford an adequate income according to what's a minimum essential standard of living. And that takes into account the cost of goods and services. So as people, as they become more affordable or accessible, it impacts on the minimum essential standard of living. So it's extremely important in the first case, and this is relevant for this committee in a wider context, not just in terms of the Sustainable Development Goals, is that the social welfare levels are adequate for people to be able to afford a minimum essential standard of living. And just to be able to stand still this year, organisations across the sector based on that research are calling for €27.50 on social welfare rates. Now that's a big ask, but that's just for people to be able to stand still based on the impact of inflation over the last year or so. And that's not even moving towards a minimum essential standard of living. And that impacts on households and across a range of access to services and support. So just, I think it's extremely important then in making that point in relation to the government's targets, or how it's meeting the Sustainable Development Goals. The other point I wanted to make is to look a little bit about the overall achievement of targets, which is raised earlier by Deputy O'Cahasey as well. While it may be reported that the government is meeting its overall poverty target in relation to the Sustainable Development Goals, that as we mentioned earlier, as mentioned by other colleagues, that we know the poverty levels are rising more generally. But also it's extremely important in the context, and was mentioned by your Chair in the introduction, it's about how the overall Sustainable Development Goals delivers for all groups across society as well. So even within those overall targets, there is the overall objective of leaving no one behind and reaching those furthest behind first. So that's why we have to look at it really in terms of not just overall targets, but how it's delivering for those subgroups. So that's why disaggregated data is extremely important. We know that there are gaps. We know that there are very high poverty levels, high levels of unemployment among certain groups in relation to SDG 8. But the disaggregated data, there are gaps, for example, in relation to ethnic identifiers. For some groups, traveller organisations and others have called for greater use of ethnic identifiers. We know what the gaps are and what access to health, for example, are for particular groups. The employment levels for people with disabilities, the latest data depends on the census. It must be more up to date than that. It's not adequate. The survey of income and living conditions misses out on certain groups in our society as well, such as travellers, other minorities, Roma, homeless people and so on. So while it's important that we achieve the targets for the overall population, it's also that the government sets its ambition for every group in society so that we leave no one behind. And that's why Coalition 2030 published that report, just to draw attention to the fact that while it's important to achieve the overall targets, we cannot leave anyone behind in how we're achieving those. So that's why the disaggregated data is important at that level, just so we're ensured that we're not leaving anyone behind, both in terms of our ambition, but in terms of how we measure our progress. Thank you.
Thank you. Ms Bennett.
Thank you very much, and I might pass to my colleague in a moment as well. Just in relation to Deputy Donnelly's discussion around the digital divide, certainly, and you know, I live quite near Louise, I live in rural Ireland, you couldn't move for broadband trucks up country roads during the pandemic because it was a real kind of sticking point where we suddenly realised just how bad things were. And while things have certainly improved, there are households who are still struggling with it. And particularly, you know, when we start to kind of again disaggregate the data on it and we look in terms of ages, for example, we're seeing high levels of just very basic or low levels of digital literacy among our adult population. If we are to move towards more kind of, you know, we've got an e-health strategy now, we're looking at e-public services, the people who cannot keep up with that are going to miss out on essential, critical services. And obviously, as our education system is becoming more digitised, you know, it starts there, it starts young. There were great moves, and we welcome them very much in terms of primary school books and the subsidisation of those in Budget 23. But there needs to be more in relation to the digital needs of students, but also in terms of older people and more targeted supports there. In relation to the medical cards and the access to medical cards, I think there's probably two elements to it for us. The first is that we've been calling for a long time for the individualisation of welfare support so that it's not based on your household income, but actually on what you yourself need. Because we know, for example, that not every household is happy and homogenous and works together and, you know, shares everything. We know that there are difficulties, and those difficulties need to be addressed. But also, you know, based on studies at an international level, we're the only country that doesn't have a universal access to primary care. We've been calling for quite some time in relation to what's now community health care networks and community, but where primary care networks. You know, we very much welcome the 2016 publication of Sláintecare, but we've only seen the infrastructure investment once, and that was during COVID, when the 500 million that was committed to every year for 6 years was actually allocated. That now needs to be ramped up. That is so out of date now. Those numbers are so out of date that needs to be addressed in terms of just access across the board. So you don't have those kind of dips and those areas that we all know of, that you can be a fiver over your assessment. In relation to the quality education side and the DESH Plus, Absolutely. I mean, there are still issues in DESH schools in terms of competing with peers in non-DESH schools, but we are seeing, and particularly since the massive increases in inflation, we're seeing much more disadvantage in what were mainstream schools. We're seeing kids coming to school with inadequate lunches, they can't concentrate. There's an explosion in terms of child mental health. We very much welcomed a recent announcement that there would be an increase for psychological supports at primary level, but it needs to be immediate because we know that there are inadequate SNA hours. We know that there are children who aren't getting full hours in school. They're on short days. That isn't addressing the kind of leaving people behind. They are our most vulnerable and they are being completely left behind. So certainly there needs to be additional supports at a mainstream level to ensure that people who have additional needs are actually getting them so that they can thrive. And then in relation to waste management, this brings, I suppose, a much bigger issue to focus. And Deputy, you were there when we launched our SEO, our socio-economic review, in the AV room recently, and the issue of privatisation came up again and again and again, and this is part of that. When it was municipal offering a service that was provided as a kind of a public good, people got on with it. It was a job that people had with pride, and they did their job. Once you start tendering for it, you start privatising it. The role that you privatise for becomes what was contained in your tender, and anything that wasn't contained in that is left behind. And that's why you have these disparities. You have these areas that aren't getting their green or their brown bins collected, or don't have brown bins at all. I don't think I have a brown bin actually. But you start to constrict what you can actually get, and it leaves gaps. And it leaves gaps. Like, I walked from Houston this morning. You've got bins left, right and centre up Dublin city centre. And it does, it then has a knock-on impact on everything else. But that's just one area of privatisation when this is a kind of much more systemic problem. Thank you.
Thank you. Senator Burke.
Thanks, Chairman. I'd like to welcome all the groups and thank them for the submissions. And I'm not going to be going over all the questions that was raised by my colleagues, but just two areas. The international poverty line, it says it was $1.15 per day, and the World Bank, I think, put it up to $2.15 a day. What do you think the Irish line would be? How much would it be a day?
The Irish line is 318, just over 318 a week.
318.
That's the poverty line. Yeah.
318 pound or euros.
318 euro a week. Yeah.
So anybody below 318 is below the poverty line.
318.53. Yeah.
So that's does that take into account then? We'll say monies that's paid by local authorities for housing, or taken in, does it take everything into consideration?
That's based on the SILK study, the Survey on Income and Living Conditions. So it's an income survey and living condition survey, and it's based on 60% of the median income. So if you line everybody up in terms of the lowest to the highest income, the person bang in the middle is your median, and you take 60% of that. That's your poverty line. So for a single adult, the weekly poverty line is 318.
And you're saying then that there's some reports saying then that we're 9th out of 16, is it, in the world or in Europe?
That's our Sustainable Progress Index. So yes, compared to our EU 14 peers, we are 9th. So
who's the top?
Who's top?
Who's number one?
Do you know, no one ever asks that. It's always. I'll have to come back to you, Deputy, and I will get it for you in a minute.
So, but we are considered to have a very good social welfare system here, and if you look at Ukrainians, they seem to be coming here because of the social welfare system in some cases. But we're still only 9th out of 16, and we're on 3. I wonder ours is 315 or 318 per week. I wonder what the top line or the number one spot, how much, what would that be? But of course, it takes health and everything into consideration.
Well, I suppose income is just one aspect of it. So if you take the SDGs as a whole, that's what the ranking is based on. Denmark is the first ranked country, by the way. But so it's looking at more than just incomes and poverty rates. It's looking at education, our healthcare system, our transparency in terms of our government system, our ODA, our official development assistance. It's looking at all of that in the round across the 17 goals, and that's where those numbers are coming from for our index.
Secondly, in relation to you say that all of this area should be moved into the Taoiseach's department, that the Taoiseach should. You can't go any higher than the Taoiseach's department. On the other hand, then you're saying that there should be a Futures Generation Commissioner. And the Futures Generation Commissioner wouldn't have any power for developing policy. What would the Futures Generation Commissioner do? It's another office that will be fully staffed, I presume, because millions, good few million a year to run the office. That office would, whether it's he or she that's be in control of it, they would identify, I presume, the poverty traps or whatever, and highlight them. Or
so yes, we are advocating for these two items for the SDG overall delivery and implementation to be moved to the Office of the Taoiseach. At the moment, it's in the Department of the Environment, Climate and Communications. We feel that it needs leadership from the very top in order to facilitate that interdepartmental working and ambition for the SDGs, which to date we haven't seen at the scale or urgency that is required. And to date also we haven't received an adequate response as to why it is not in the Department of the Taoiseach, and it's further entrenching the idea that the SDGs are an environmental agenda when I think we've clearly articulated they're far more than that. They are about the society and about an economy that works for everybody. There are a number of other units that are in the Department of the Taoiseach's remit. So you have the Wellbeing Initiative. You also have the recent, I think it's the Child Poverty Unit, that's in the Department of the Taoiseach as well. And you can see the resourcing and that is put behind these initiatives when they're in there. And resourcing and the lack of adequate resourcing is a key issue we have found consistently since Agenda 2030 was agreed by all UN member states. Then secondly, with the Future Generations Commissioner, so their role in particular would be to be a set of eyes on policy coherence. So this is an idea, it's within SDG 17, Policy Coherence for Sustainable Development, or PCSD. As alluded to earlier, the SDGs, they can have positive ripple effects if one is integrated. Say if we have climate initiatives that can positively impact health in terms of air pollution, to just give one example. We can also have the opposite effect. There can be trade-offs. So for example, our national tax policies might have negative implications for SDG delivery and achievement around the world. So the Future Generations Commissioner would be a commissioner tasked with keeping an eye on, for want of a better term, this policy coherence and drawing attention to those trade-offs. At the moment, we don't have somebody who's responsible for that. So we are seeing trade-offs happening between departments. There is an interdepartmental working group set up. Last time I checked, the minutes for that were updated. The last minutes were from 2019. It's now, halfway through 2023, and the minutes just haven't been updated. That's not good enough. The senior officials group, we know, is chaired by the Department of the Taoiseach, but we're not having the impact that we need. And just for an example, the two departments under this committee's purview, the annual reports, the most recent annual reports, they're not at, the departments aren't reporting at target level. Again and again, and it's not the only department by a long stretch, but this has to happen. That's as per the National Implementation Plan, and we don't have a clear outline of how the departments are doing on each of the targets that it's responsible for as per the policy map. So there are a lot of things that aren't being done. If it was in the Department of the Taoiseach, we feel this would have a lot more impetus and urgency. and we wouldn't be facing a lot of the trade-offs that we see kind of in Irish society. Happy to send on more information though.
The Futures Generation Commissioner would be responsible for trading off, whether it's tax or whatever.
For identifying trade-offs and making opinion. So they importantly, they wouldn't be part of any political party. They would outlive the short-lived political and economic cycles, and they would make recommendations, and they would draw attention to potential trade-offs.
And all the SDGs, they'd all feed into the Future Generations Commissioner's office. Would that be the case as well?
Yeah, so they would have an overarching view, bird's eye view of how the country is doing on all of its SDGs. This takes into account, because it is a policy framework, as pointed out, all of our policies. So it would be a significant job, and they would identify, say, if we have a fisheries policy, for example, that perhaps.
But it could be another line of bureaucracy, could it, as well?
It depends how it's managed. We are not advocating for another commission that doesn't have another commissioner that doesn't have a very specific role. We're not advocating for anything that isn't necessary. This is absolutely necessary.
So you're
it
looking
has
for
been shown to have real
office with
impact in
teeth.
Wales. An office with teeth, exactly.
Yeah, thanks.
Just on the issue of the Department of the Taoiseach, the reality is the measurement takes place in the Department of Taoiseach. The CSO has been mandated to provide the data and measurement in relation to the Sustainable Development Goals, not just here in Ireland, but it's been used as a template globally, and that is directly under the Department of the Taoiseach. So if we're measuring it under the Department of the Taoiseach, it would make sense that the reporting would be to the Department of the Taoiseach. Senator Garvey.
Yeah, it's very important. It's great that we have this opportunity to talk about sustainable development goals. I used to teach about them in schools for many years and do workshops to introduce the concepts, because the vocabulary around them is quite interesting. It's not the best vocabulary I would use, I think, for getting things across the line and people understanding it, but I think they are really, really important. I suppose for somebody who's a Green Party councillor or a senator and was an environmental education officer for many years with Green Schools, I was wondering, how do you see the roles of the local authorities in all of this? There is some minor support for green schools in the local authorities, but then beyond that, I'm not sure. I would see it as being vital that our local authorities have a very strong role to play in implementing our sustainable, and it should be across all the departments in the local authorities. Because what I've learned from as a senator, that even when a department does have a recommendation, it doesn't always necessarily come down to the local authorities, and grassroots has always been where changes come. So, I mean, I know there's a biodiversity officer now, thanks to Malcolm Noonan in most places. There's now kind of climate teams, but if it's nobody's job to implement the Sustainable Development Goals, it'll be everybody's job, and it'll be nobody's job. And so I think that's a huge issue I would have worry about. We have biannual meetings as all the national representatives in Clare with our directors of service and CEOs. Nobody's ever mentioned Sustainable Development Goals except me. It's never been brought up with us. I have huge concerns about it actually filtering down on some local level, or it being shoved into, that's in the whole climate thing, you know what I mean? And our biodiversity sits in one directorate, separate to climate as well, which is also quite bizarre. So I just think if we're serious about it, I just wondered if you had any plans to come up with ways of forcing us to make the local authorities take the Sustainable Development Goals seriously. I know the Environmental Awareness Officer herself does a lot of good work on it, but I feel like she's doing it in kind of a silo as opposed to it being a whole council initiative. Just something that came up earlier, and I had to go there to talk about water quality actually with the Minister, the Commencement Matter. I was in Inisheer recently, and I know that a lot of the islands suffer from water quality issues and not having access to water, but Irish Water has zero plans to do any rainwater harvesting, for example. I don't know why that isn't happening, and we're definitely missing a trick there, because I'm sure, water comes into the Sustainable Development Goals, and rainwater can be used for so many things, and actually if treated with UV light it can actually be used for everything. And I just wonder about that. I did also see a great digi-hub in Inisheer, which I think should be something that should be mandatory if we want people to have some way. I think one of the senators said it earlier, ministers, or TD, sorry, about access to broadband. I know in Innisheer, the community officers there have done great work in getting a very successful DigiHub that I'm planning to use myself this summer. Yeah, I suppose the thing for me is to do with the local authorities, and if we're talking about the islands and local, why isn't there community composting? Why isn't there community rainwater harvesting? The waste management thing, some of the ferry companies are not giving a single penny to the islands, and they're making millions out of bringing people to the islands. And, you know, should we be looking at some kind of a policy, a mandatory percentage of profits being given back to the islanders? I was talking to a businessman in one of the islands, and their community did approach the ferry company, and they said no, it's up to the local authorities. So that's an issue as well, because we know when you've got thousands of people coming to islands, you know, it's not a leave no trace, it's leave everything behind you. It's the opposite to leave no trace. There's no policy about bringing all your rubbish home with you. So you have the ferry companies charging everybody loads of money to get them to the islands, and not responsible in any way then for what the footprint of that is. So I think that's something we have to look at as well if we're talking about.
I think in fairness there would be fees paid by the ferry companies.
It depends on the local authorities.
Yes.
Some of them are delivering to islands that are not in their local authority, and that's where you have an issue. So it's just something I wanted to raise. And if they are paying to the local authority, is that money going directly to the island is the other thing.
Yeah, well,
because it's not
an issue I think we need to take up with the LGMA, not with the ferry companies here this morning.
Yeah, I just think it's part of the Sustainable Development Goals. If we want the islands to be able to sustain themselves, they're going to need extra financial support, and maybe that should be looked at as coming from the ferry companies that might be making money out of getting people there and not taking any responsibility for their footprint. Yeah, I just think because of the challenges we face around climate change, well, there are going to be more vulnerabilities for rural dwellers and islanders. I think rural transport has a massive part to play, and I think it's something that we can't underestimate. I would love to see all my other rural colleagues and TDs that are independents going on about rural transport as much as I do, because I think they're missing a trick there in dealing with rural isolation and affordability and less dependence on fossil fuels to get around. Of course you can drive your car, we're not saying you can't, but we do have to bring choices to rural Ireland, and we have done lots on Local Link, but we have a lot more to do. And
some of us have made very detailed submissions to the NTA regarding these issues as well.
Yeah, me too. Yeah, I do. But I think it's a good job to air it here, the importance of rural transport if we're talking about sustainable development goals.
But,
and justice,
Senator Garvey, at the start of the meeting,
just transition, I suppose.
I lay out very clearly that you cannot make accusations, and you are treading very close to the line on a number of occasions this morning. So I would ask you to direct questions specifically to the witnesses that are here before
I did start with the question. I'm just backing up the question around how they see the role of...
Specifically, because we are limited in relation to time. We have other business to get through before the deadline of midday, and I have accommodated you because I know you were in the Shannon.
Yeah, I suppose we've so little... we've never really addressed SDGs in this committee, and it's supposed to be on every committee, so I feel it's important. Just, I suppose, the point I'm trying to make is, where does it sit with local authorities? I'd love your advice on that and guidance, because I think if we don't have it taken really seriously at a local authority level, I don't know what we're going to do.
Mr. Sheehan.
Yeah, so Johnny Sheehan from The Wheel, and I'm a part of Coalition 2030. So in terms of local authorities, but also more broadly kind of the role at local level, so you've got, you know, the local authorities, you've got community organisations, community development programmes and so on, working to, like, all of them, their missions are delivering on one or more of the Sustainable Development Goals. I think that's important to note. The Department of Rural and Community Development, alongside, Louise mentioned there, our Rural Future Strategy. There's also the Sustainable, Inclusive and Empowered Communities Strategy for the 5-year strategy for the community and voluntary sector. And, you know, it very much states that, you know, it strengthen and build understanding, capacity, support implementation of the SDGs National Implementation Plan, and it commits a number of things, including developing programmes to implement and raise awareness of the SDGs for local community LCDCs, local authorities, government departments and so on, and supporting capacity in relation to the SDGs at a local level, and you know, and providing support, including funding to all sectors to implement the SDGs. And one of the things I suppose we'd be saying in this is that, you know, it's not clear how much progress. I mean, for example, organisations are asked now, which a lot of, you know, to map what they do to the SDGs, but it doesn't go further than that. It doesn't. It's okay. You map it, and then that's it. You now know about the Sustainable Development Goals. Jobs done, perhaps. So more needs to be done. So perhaps it's a role for the committee to actually, like, go back to the RCD. How is that, like, to what end is that being done? To what extent is awareness being raised? But more than that, are we working with community and voluntary organisations? Are we working with local authorities to actually implement the Sustainable Development Goals? Because, you know, I mean, there's a number of commitments in the policy map that Megan mentioned, around, for example, support partnerships and collaboration. So in Goal 17, the partnerships and collaboration, and actually working with community organisations on the ground. I met yesterday with an organisation that is involved in recycling and upcycling of, for example, providing old bikes, to doing them up and providing them to deaf schools, to migrant groups. All of these groups, ensuring that they are supported, that through their work we are achieving the Sustainable Development Goals. So adequate resourcing for those community groups, but also with the local authorities. For example, there are public participation networks in every local authority area around the country. That network of local community and voluntary organisations, environmental organisations, organisations working around social inclusions, directly addressing the delivery of the SDGs. And the role of those public participation networks, they need to be adequately resourced and supported to actually implement the sustainable goals at local level. There have been good initiatives, like the Department of Rural and Community Development developed guidance around the values and principles for partnership and collaboration with the community and voluntary sector, and that's great that that's been done. But again, just producing the guidance isn't enough. It's actually ensuring that that is brought to local authorities and everyone else in terms of delivery, that this will actually be used to improve the way in which this operates. We saw it with the COVID crisis. We're seeing now with the Ukraine crisis, the realisation that on the ground we need that partnership and collaboration approach between the state and those local groups around the country in order that we can adequately support whether it's Ukrainian refugees or international protection applicants around the country, and to counter also negative publicity or negative kind of media and stuff around it. So I think that that's really important, that we recognise stuff that's done, but equally identify, like, to what end is this being done. So,
yeah, just before Ms. Rogers comes in there, just to make it quite clear and put it on the record that, look, the very companies meet with their licensing requirements that are set down by statute by both local authorities, and in many cases which are tendered by the department that's within under our competency. And I recall listening to Marion Broderick, the retired GP on Inishmore, making the point that the very companies themselves were very responsive to the issues around COVID-19 in terms of trying to protect island communities.
In fairness, Senator, that's true virtually for every island, with the exception of Innisfree and Inishmore and Inishmaan, but particularly Innisfree and Inishmore, where there's commercial companies operating side by side with the...
Yes,
but the contracted companies, the fares they charge are fixed by the department. I think they're €10, is that correct? €10 for an adult. Max. So the maximum fares, and there's limit on the profits they can make.
But the point I'm making here is that all of the operators that are servicing our island communities are licensed. They are meeting with the requirements in relation to their licence. We are a legislative assembly here. If we have any issues with those licences, the responsibility is on us to provide the statutory footing to amend those licences, and I want to make it quite clear, as far as the committee is concerned, that those licences are being complied with. I do not want to open up the discussion any further. I'll now take Ms. Rogers.
Just to go back to your point of the local authority piece, I think it's about that subsidiarity. It's about where decisions are made, and we are very centralised. So because this is all policy for all people, that's what the SDGs, it's what's that movie, Everything Everywhere All at Once, but that's really the important piece, and it goes back to this sort of siloed approach and policy coherence that our colleagues have touched on. And I think that's the difficulty, I think, from the local authority point of view, is the types of decisions that are made at local authority level and where they sit with the types of policy decisions that are made at national level and where they interact. So if you look at things like the digital disadvantage that you mentioned, so broadband is a national rollout. So the local authority will have a limited amount of room for manoeuvre. So like when we look at, say, where, internet connectivity, 94% across the country, but then you can see 92% in Dublin, 86% in the Mid-East, and then as we start to move, 77% in the border, and 79% in the Midlands. So there is a disparity as you move across the country for delivery of services, and I think that's the difficulty. But then again, it ties into this whole thing of tying it all together at a national level, because even things like waste management.
In fairness to the chair here, when he was minister, a decision was made to make a physical rollout of fibre into every house and business in the country. And the government adopted that, and that's been rolled out. Now, there's a physical rollout time, and it is a bit frustrating, but the way they're building the network is, by definition, from nodes outwards. So I'm fortunate I live in one of those areas. The outside areas are going to get it last, because you can't build the node outwards, because it's a brand new system. It's not part of the air system. They're using poles, but they're not using cable. Without building them outwards. Now, I don't know why we're spending so much time here on something that's effectively done and will be done by 2026.
Yeah, I wasn't raising fibre rollout.
Yeah, no, and look, we, as a committee, we
so Eamon can come in whenever he wants, and I can't.
No, without interruption, Senator Garvey.
Eamon just comes in when he wants.
No, it wasn't aimed at you, Senator Garvey. Without interruption, we'll hear from Ms Rogers, and the committee will seek an update regarding the delivery of the National Broadband Plan from NBI. But Ms Rogers, if you want to complete your evidence.
Thank you. It was just a discussion of, say, the digital disadvantage, that, again, the policy coherence piece. So as you said, you've got this big push to get us all online, a big push to get everybody a tablet, every child to get a tablet. There's a big push for older people, to get online throughout COVID, and yet that requires data centres, that requires for all of that stuff to be held somewhere. So that's somebody else's department to do that. And then the impact of that then is brownouts and our climate action goals. So again, those three things are linked. You've got three separate government departments doing a great job, getting us all online, bringing in foreign direct investment, and then trying to meet our climate action goals. But they are in tension with each other. So I think that's against, but like that would be a national policy that I don't know where that can fit in at local level. And again, your waste management piece, there was a piece of research done in Fingal, so again, done at local level, I think 2017, that showed it would be cheaper to go back to remunicipalisation of waste collection services in Fingal, because they were spending so much cleaning up from tipping, and that hasn't gone anywhere at a local level or a national level. And I know Dublin City Council are really trying very, very hard at the moment, again, to make them move back to doing a local council waste collection. And they're really coming up against barriers in terms of what they can do, as you said, within the free market, within the private market in terms of competition. So for me, I think there's a real struggle there between, as I said, the types of decisions that are made. But it's about weaving all of this into every policy decision. It's about having oversight and saying every policy. So a waste, where does that sit in with our SDGs? And I think really embedding it into local government probably. But I don't know whether that has to come from national down or, as you said, from the PPNs up. But I think there is a limit sometimes as to what sort of decisions can be made at local authority.
Deputy O'Queen.
Could I just reply then?
No, we're under pressure for time here, and we have a lot of work in front of us. A brief question then, Senator Garvey. Brief question,
reply.
but not reference to any of the material that you referenced earlier.
I wasn't asking about fibre broadband. I was just saying when we're waiting, because it came up as an issue, the DigiHub in Inisheer has been a solution to that issue, so maybe that's something that can be looked at the islands. And the other thing about the ferries was just I was saying they could donate. I know that I wasn't questioning.
Yeah, I've asked you, Senator Garvey, I've asked you not to reference that issue again. So, Senator Garvey, please desist. Please desist.
No, but you're
Senator or Deputy O'Keefe. Deputy O'Keefe, without interruption.
Fáilte roimh on the hÉireann, you're all welcome from the islands. It's good to see you. Now, I suppose I've always found that the big policy issues are relatively easy. Delivery is always our problem. And I'd like to reference some of the issues raised. Housing is a big issue on the islands. There's no question or doubt about that. My view is we need a bank of land in each island for social, affordable and other permanent housing, because there are people moving into islands, they can't get a site, and if they get a site, they can't get planning permission. And I believe we have to tackle that issue nationally. I was disappointed it wasn't tackled more comprehensively in the Islands Plan. The second thing is, a positive one is the Croí Cónaithe, because the Croí Cónaithe means that if there is a derelict house, and if you do it up, for permanent dwelling, it cannot be done up as a holiday home, there's up to €90,000 available plus the SAI grants. So I think we should note that, because that is a step in the right direction, because it stops them all being sold off as they are at the moment as holiday homes, or at least it gives you a competitive advantage on the market. Just as a matter of interest, if you get planning permission in Galway for a house on a family need basis or a housing need basis, there's an inurement put in that for 7 years that you must have resided in that house for 7 years. And if you sell it, the person who gets it has to have resided in it for 7 years before you can sell it on the open market. So you can't build a house and then say, haha, I didn't really want this for a house. And I think that's something very positive, and I've always supported that policy. Water and sanitation. My belief on the islands is, as I think all my island friends know, is that the island fund should make a contribution towards this, because if you're waiting for Irish Water to do it on the basis of population, you'll always be the bottom of the queue because of the very dispersed small populations and inaccessibility and cost prices. And therefore, I believe that we need to just bump up the island fund and get the Department of the Islands to negotiate to deliver on water and sanitation. We can talk about all the policies we want. The question is, how are you going to deliver? Simon and Tude, you're absolutely right. There should be facility for second level education. I think you know the problem we're hitting up against. It should be linked into the local school, and we have to get a synergy between the local school and the island, because the students as they grow up will want to be able to access some things in the local school with the facilities they have and so on. And on the other hand, should be getting other parts of their education on the island. And it could be all hybrid. It could be 2 days a week, 3 days a week. It could be summer terms, winter term. There's different things you can do in different places. Some of it will be distance education. But the distance education should be to the local, the nearest school possible, because then they could in person attend. For example, if you're doing physics, you could do all the theory online, but you'd have to do the practicals in the laboratories. What I find a lot of these things, the big policy is right, but we need to get all the players locally to buy in. On the freight issue, Simon, I'm aware of the problem. The freight prices should be negotiated when the contract comes up, and the islanders should insist on getting it totally revised from A to Z. Again, that issue we've discussed, but it does need to happen. You see, what actually happened was that in Inishmore, the freight prices were brought down 2/3 from what they used to be historically. So they were very happy. There are anomalies in the price list, and I think we need to tackle that. And I think it is very, very tactable, because the department should exceed, when the new contracts coming up, that the freight prices give you the benefit of the subsidy. Rural Ireland and sustainable goals, and this is particularly relevant to islands, but it's also relevant to the mainland. There's two ways of trying to solve a problem. One is to move all the people into cities, but we know the problem that gives us. And anyway, you'll have a residual population in the country, so you'll still have to run all your electric cables and so on, and you'll still have to provide the services. Much more rational, of course, is to keep viable rural communities and decarbonise the community. And as somebody living in a rural area, and I have already got solar panels for my water, but my intention is to put solar panels in for my electricity. So not only will I be producing my own, but I'll export any surplus. Also, in time, when to become a reasonable value, to get an EV car. Now, at this stage, you're beginning to run thin in the arguments against it, except lots of people don't like rural houses, but that's their tough luck. As far as I'm concerned, that's a democratic debate we have to have for those who are for or those who are against, but that, I don't think sustainability is necessary. Because in other ways, social sustainability of rural communities is extraordinarily good. Achievement of young people growing up tends to be very, very high. And therefore, if we're talking about total sustainability, I think we have to consider issues other than just pure carbon, because carbon is eliminatable by technology. And I'm a great believer in technology. As I said in relation to the broadband, and this goes back to the technology again, coming to the people rather than the people going to the technology. My guess is that these digital hubs will be relatively little used within 5 years, except by those who visit our areas. That the vast majority of rural people with digital access, as I do at home, I'm lucky, I think of 60 meg fibre to the box. And an awful lot of my neighbours, some of them, there's a massive digital divide within most rural communities. 100 houses have fibre. About 20 houses are like me, fibre to the box. And then there's about 200 houses who are dependent on mobile systems. But the one great thing is, and it's be great to get the update, and there's been a little bit of slippage, but by 2026, give or take, everybody is going to have it. And we're not going to change how that's going to happen except to keep the skids under them. But we're not going to change fundamentally how we're going to deliver this. And I think nobody at this stage wants to go back into policy, and I compliment the Chair for the work that he did on that and for delivering fibre rather than 30 meg, which was a major victory against the naysayers. Rural transport, this again is fair. You know, the theory is fine. So they gave us 2 new bus connects serving the Connemara region. One going from Inchatarua to Clamorris, and the other going from Inchatarua to Clifton, and there's another one going from Clifton to to Westport. So I say, yippee, we got 3 services a day each way. We'll take that as a start, not too bad. Except one problem. Coming from Dublin, as I do, bus stops were a few hundred yards apart. I asked them, how far apart are these bus stops? Some of them are over 14 kilometres apart, so you'd have to take, for older people, you're not going to cycle there and you're unlikely to walk there. And that's once you get to the main road. That's once you get to the main road. You might be down a Boyd in another distance. And we have a great ability to have the great policy. But I spend my life on delivery.
And on that, Deputy O'Queen, Louise Lennon can tell you that that's not happening just in rural areas, but it's happening in the town of Athlone, which has been designated to grow as a city, where there's different hubs for different connections. Do you want to bring in the witnesses? Who wants to come in first in relation to that? Ms Bennett.
Thank you very much, Chair, and thank you, Deputy. Just in relation to housing, particularly your reference to the Cree Connacht, absolutely welcome for those for whom it works. But there are issues with, again, the implementation of it. So, you know, that there are upfront costs. There is a lack of bridging finance to be able to actually access it, because you need to have the property to be able to do it up and then get the rebate back. So there is a review necessary in relation to the implementation of that to make it more effective and to be able to kind of broaden its remit, I suppose. In relation to the energy, and my colleagues I'm sure will talk about the fuel poverty, for those, again, who can afford to put in solar and who can retrofit, there are, again, SEAI grants that are very valuable. But for those who don't fit within the very narrow definition or eligibility criteria of the kind of the social homes one, there are still upfront costs that can be 35 to 50,000 in retrofitting that many households just can't afford. So that, again, there needs to be, it's back to implementation. There needs to be a review of how you can make that more accessible to people who desperately need it. In relation to the rural transport, I mean, again, and Louise probably will say, that there's many things to discuss, but certainly, my colleague here, he came on the bus, I came on the train this morning because the time was right. The time of this committee was right. I have sat in other committees that sat in the afternoon or the evening, and I've had to drive from Athlone because there isn't a train that'll get you back past 7:20, and there isn't a bus until 10 o'clock. So it's again, it's about that implementation. It's about building on what has been done and making sure that it is accessible, that there aren't people being left behind because of the gaps that exist in terms of what is there, so that there is a broader spread.
I mean, I've been arguing that one for 30 years. I remember one night being on Vincent Brown and he asked me why I didn't take the train. And I said, well, there's no train to Carnamona. Why don't you take the bus? I said, there's no bus to Carnamona. Game, set, match. Now, the other reason I never took the train, amongst many, was that after 7 o'clock in the evening, I don't think there's any train to Galway. No. So forget it. Now, but these are all practical issues. That's what I'm talking about, exactly what I'm talking about. Most of the snags we as politicians say, they're not the high-level goals. I remember saying to the Secretary General of the department who came in, we were started at the same time, I said, what you're going to find is the devil's in the detail all the time. The high-level stuff's awful easy.
We might get Ms. Carmody to come in on that.
Yeah, thank you very much for your contribution, Deputy. So, zooming out a little bit to that high-level perspective, upon looking at the strategies of the Department of Social Protection and the Department of Rural Community Development, there's no evidence that the Sustainable Development Goals have been used from the outset in order to address the various policies that have been, or the various issues that the policies raised have been designed in order to address. If the questions were asked at the outset around how is somebody who's disabled going to cope with a 14-kilometre gap in between bus stops, that's when that might be ameliorated. But after the fact, it's too late. And if you look at both of the strategies, there's...
Common sense would have told you, come on, you don't need a massive...
No, we don't.
We don't need a massive sustainable guidelines to tell us. We have
a number of witnesses that want to come in, and we have other business that we need to get through before 12 o'clock. Ms. Carmody, without interruption.
Yeah, just to finish, what we're advocating is for the SDGs to be used as a policy framework so that people don't fall through the gaps and are not left further behind. If we don't do that, we're going to continue having these frustrating conversations that are very practical in their nature, but could have been remedied by that perspective from the outset. The SDGs are not another add-on. They're not another strategy or another policy. They are the overarching umbrella that needs to inform all policies from now on.
Thank you. Ms. Louise Lennon, followed by John Walsh. Louise.
Thank you, Chair, and thank you, Deputy O'Queen, for his comments there. I'll just come in on some of the transport points, and yeah, like as Megan said there, the SDGs should be used as that overarching framework, I suppose, for our policy design, and the Connecting Ireland piece. The work that's been done on that, we do welcome the the rollout of the local link services and the increase, but I know our CEO was in with this committee a few weeks ago with 2 local link providers, and a lot of the issues they've raised are around that, I suppose, bridging that gap between where there is where a service ends and another one begins, I suppose, and connecting literally the services together. I suppose we're currently doing a piece of work with Social Justice Ireland around just transition and wellbeing in rural communities, and transport has come up, and it continues to be the main barrier for a lot to access a lot of other services. But some of the issues, or some of the factors that I suppose would increase it is having that, I suppose, that last mile piece of transport, which could be delivered at a more local level through community car scheme or that Uber style, to get that person from their home to the bus stop or the train station, or whichever is closest to them, and even to the local link bus stop if it's not a door-to-door service. And also, even the park and ride, like even in towns, the train stations, the parking facilities aren't big enough to cater for many days for people who want to use the train. So that's another issue then that can cause, disincentivises people to use the public transport service that is available to them. And also, again, having those facilities for the local link services as well, it is needed. Like if Connecting Ireland is going to connect, it has to connect people, and it has to make sure that those people who are furthest behind, those older people with disabilities who can't make that journey to the bus stop or by walking or by bike, that they have the choice, they have an option there to have transport available to them. Thank you.
Thank you. John, you might come in there now, John Walsh, and just if you could maybe keep the committee updated on that second iteration of the UCC housing report. The committee would be very anxious to get a copy of that report and a briefing as soon as it is completed. So John Walsh, and then the final contributor is truly, you're going to get the last word. John.
Okay, thank you, Chair. So first of all, I'd agree with Deputy O'Keefe on the land bank on islands. I know at the moment we're actually looking at a farm that's after coming up for sale on Bear Island, and the community is on board with it, and we think if we could buy it, it could be used for a number of things. We need a community centre, we need childcare, as stated earlier, plus we could have social housing, plus affordable housing, plus sites that people could actually purchase, because it's very difficult to purchase a single site. But I approached the council, and while I got a very nice email back, it was kind of just showing all the problems, and I think sometimes the local authority needs to show leadership and instigate these things. A lot of times they're waiting for the islanders to do it, and then there's roadblocks being put in our way, which is very frustrating. The other side of it is the road transport. Like, I'm on the board of Local Link Cork, and I think the National Transport Authority, while they're a great organisation and they provide a lot of resources, I think they have too much say and too much authority in delivery of local services. And I think the board of any local link should be in a much better position to say where stops should be, where routes should be. Also, we're one of 4 local links that provide our own buses, and we create employment for people on C schemes and RSS schemes as bus drivers. It makes the service very adaptable, and it looks like that it's not really favoured. I think the National Transport Authority seem to want to go down the route of subbed out services or tendered services, which we don't agree with. The last thing then is fibre to islands, and I actually spoke to the chair here today, Dennis, yesterday in Clare Island, and we were discussing this, and he was saying when rural electrification came, they actually put a socket and a light into each house, and that was it. And then they discovered down the line that you could actually cook food with electricity, you could wash clothes with electricity, you could have outside lighting with electricity. And then they actually brought that in, and it's the same. If we don't get fibre to every house in Ireland, which should be the case, we're always going to be up against it. Like I've dealt with Eircom over the years, and I done a deal with Eircom to upgrade the exchange of Ireland from Dáil up to broadband. That lasted for about 3 years, and then it was the speed wasn't good enough anymore. I tried to do a deal with them again to lay a cable, but because of national broadband plan coming in, they weren't able to deal with us because we were one of the 300 houses that was in that deal. But I think fibre to the islands has to happen, and we've seen what is possible in Clare Island yesterday with the different technologies for e-health. There's a huge world out there, but we need to have the proper connectivity for all of rural Ireland, but especially the islands, I think. So thank you, Chair.
Trudy?
Yeah, just quickly to kind of give a kind of practical example of, and I totally agree with some of the comments that have been said, that first of all, the SDGs, they're not just environmental, but there's also a social economic aspect, and that they're interconnected, and therefore like collaboration between the different silos is required. One example from my previous life, I'm originally from Finland, where we did a research benchmarking how cities and city planning and development, and there was one example from the Netherlands where they have actually changed the whole organization, which they told was very painful but very fruitful, from road, housing, education, services to area specific with representation from each sector. Maybe that's something to consider. But just an example on like how progress on all of these goals is needed, especially for the offshore islands. Like example of myself. In the lucky case, if I could buy land on the island with the current holiday home prices, and I could get a grant to refurbish a derelict house, I'm also in a situation where if I had children and wanted to start a family on the island, I wouldn't have childcare for the full time. So I'd need to decide whether I stay at home or my partner would stay at home, and that's obviously impacts the income level of that family. I would do this knowing that when my children are 12, I either need to leave from the island because there's no secondary school education on the island, or I'd need to pay €100 a week to a stranger to take care of my child on the mainland with the grant, or establish a whole other household on the mainland and live separate and have like two places for one family. And also for the transport, currently I don't have a car. We don't have a public transport service on Inishbofin, for example, because it's just way too expensive and non-viable because of the insurance perspective, because the tourism season is limited at the moment. So thankfully I have good neighbours who help me out, but every time I need to go and do the so-called big shopping, in Clifton I pay €50 to go there and back. For in total for the ferry and taxi. So these are all things are linked, but hopefully with some collaboration and some of the things that, for example, James O'Keefe mentioned, these could be solved in the future.
Thanks very much, Trudy. I think you gave us a lot of food for thought in your last contribution there. Can I just say to witnesses here before us, one of the issues that the committee is looking at is the issue of performance indicators within the Department of Social Protection, and the committee feels that the current performance indicators don't accurately reflect the objectives that government has, or that should be the things that should be measured by the department. So if you have any thoughts or suggestions on how those performance indicators could reflect maybe one or two of the key indicators as far as the Sustainable Development Goals, we'd be very interested in hearing from you in relation to that. We don't want an off-the-cuff comment in relation to it. We would like some thought put into it, because this has major implications for delivery within the department, but it is a work stream that the committee are working on. So you might come back to the committee in relation to that. So that concludes our public session this morning. I want to thank all of the witnesses for their evidence here this morning, for their written submissions, for their patience in terms of getting around all of the contributors, and thank you for taking the time to inform the committee and provide evidence here today. So, Goramil Mahagiv Galer, the committee will now go into private session to consider other business.